Hey everyone, welcome back to Navigating in Balance, or welcome to Navigating in Balance, a podcast by Three Gimbals. If it's your first time listening, we're really excited to have you here today. I'm here joined with two, long-time contributors to the podcast now, some veterans of the show. So I want to give a shout out to them and let them introduce themselves here in a second, as well as kind of give y'all an intro to what we're going to be talking about today. It's something that, I was thinking about when the topic was brought up, and I'm not sure if I've ever really done a deep dive into this, but once I did, the information that I found was pretty surprising, and I think it's worth talking about. So I'll just let that kind of cliffhanger sit there for a minute without revealing to y'all what we're going to be talking about, but I am going to let these guests introduce themselves. So guys, take it away.
All right, I'll go first. Hello, my name is Martin. I am a student at FIU, Master's in Global Affairs. I also work as a researcher looking at a lot of Chinese activities throughout Latin America and the region, whether that be diplomatic, economic, or other military engagements like satellite facilities. Excited to be on the podcast. Thank you, Ben.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carlos. I am also an FIU student, a master's in Latin America, working directly under the Kimberly Green Latin America and Research Center, essentially serving as a research assistant, everything from development, trade, commerce relations, specifically between China and Latin America. And yeah, this is my second time on this podcast. Looking forward to it.
Hey, thank you guys. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm your host, Ben Butler. Really excited. So without further ado, full transparency, I'm a pretty big car guy. Always been a car guy from the time I was a very, very little kid. I would seriously, this is a true story, sit outside in my yard and watch the cars just driving through my neighborhood, and I would sit there and I would name them like according to their brand. I'd be like, oh, that's a Chevy Blazer, or like, oh, that's a Ford Mustang. I was just obsessed with cars. And so I think if you're a car person, if you're not a car person, you literally don't care. Regardless, I think one thing that you may or may not have noticed is the trend of electric cars. They're not exactly new at this point. They're becoming more popular, but in the US we've seen companies like Tesla really come on the scene and become strong, not just domestic, but global players, with a massive valuation, all sorts of, headlines, the Cybertruck. I see a bunch of those things driving around where I live. I don't know about you guys, but I know Miami or that area, there's always people showing off with them. But one thing I haven't really been following as closely, but I've noticed has been the rise of Chinese electric vehicles, just dealerships and things popping up in different countries, especially. So, quick little aside before we get into the meat and potatoes of the topic. When I was over on vacation recently, I was in two different places. I went to the Bahamas and I spent another vacation in Europe. This is a little while ago, less than a year ago though. And I saw everywhere BYD, especially in the Bahamas. There were BYD dealerships and BYD advertisements and just BYD, BYD, BYD. And I think you could ask like, well, what is that? What is BYD? Let's start there.
Well, BYD is frankly one of the rising stars of the Chinese automotive industry. It's partially state-owned, as most mega corporations are in China. That is currently it's essentially currently dominating the Chinese market right now. As historically, ever since the liberalization, it was Volkswagen and other Western companies that were dominating the Chinese market. But now BYD is practically having this explosive growth. And now, recently in the 20s and now 2020s, obviously, they've been extending their market into Latin America. And that obviously includes the Caribbean, the Bahamas, like you went to, and stuff like that, right?
And before I go to my point, Ben, I'd like to know that I'm not the only one that did that when I was a kid. It's glad that I had someone else with me doing it.
Hey, no, for real, you get it. See, you get it.
Yeah. But really what BYD is, well, their growth really stems from the fact that China itself right now is facing an issue. They've had a massive production of cars with only half the demand to meet those productions, forcing them to have to look overseas to places like Latin America, Africa, Europe, to be able to sell and actually have economic growth within their companies. And BYD is a very unique company itself, not only because of the cars they produce, but the fact of how much they can compete in cost-effective markets like Latin America. You have the BYD battery, which is more cost-effective, more affordable, higher safety measures with lower cooling or simpler cooling, which allows for a smaller battery, which means it can be cheaper and it could be built with cheaper materials. While let's say a Tesla battery, right? Because Tesla, as you mentioned earlier, one of the big EV chains, has a high density battery, which consists of nickel, manganese, and cobalt, which is a lot heavier, a lot more charging, or well, a lot more distance, in that a lot denser and higher cooling measures, which in total really doubles the price of the car. So if you go to like Latin America or Africa, they're not going to be looking for the most expensive cars. They're going to be looking for something cost effective that can run just as well or better than a American.
To build up further on what Martin just said, they have such a large production scale, and as they said, they're trying to offshore right now. Just in 2024, they sold 4.2 million electric vehicles in China, and now they're trying to expand into Latin America, because Latin America specifically is one of those markets across the world that are having like such a rising demand for vehicles, because it's a rising market to begin with, right? And most of that rising demand comes from our two favorite countries to analyze right now, which is Mexico and Brazil, right? Both of which have such strong, already established relations with the PRC when it comes to automobile industries. So of course, you have this large company that has all the financial capital it needs to start expanding. So that's why you start seeing them everywhere, specifically when all the traditional car firms like GM, Chevrolet, Ford are all starting to withdraw from Latin American markets, much to their own detriment.
Interesting. So I think there's a couple directions we could take this conversation, but first, I wanted to address, Martin, a point that you made regarding the technology behind what BYD is putting together in terms of their finished product. Is their technology fundamentally better than what we're seeing from EVs coming from other companies? How are they able to produce cars and vehicles that are so effective at such a low price?
Well, honestly, it's because it's the cheap labor and it's the cheap resources they need to make the product, because there's an abundance of that resource, right? BYD's low density battery is the lithium ion battery that you find in many Chinese EV vehicles now. It's very common. A lot of these companies ought to make it. And to note, China controls, although only percent of the world's nickel, 5% of the manganese, 41% of the world's cobalt. They refine 95% of the world's manganese, 73% of the world's cobalt, 67% of the world's lithium, and 63% of the world's nickel. So when you really take that into account, they can control the price and the cost of it due to the fact that they own the refinement and the battery making process throughout. So when they sell it, they can sell for a price that they set due to the demand they have of those materials. And it's not necessarily technologically superior to us at all, but it's just more effective due to the markets they're targeting, right? If BYD is selling a car that is slightly less or equal to a Tesla, but half the price, everyone's going to buy the BYD before thinking about a Tesla, especially when BYD announces things like the ability to charge their vehicle from 0 to 100% in 5 minutes, while Tesla battery can take around 7 to 8 hours, depending on the port that you have, if I'm not mistaken.
To further build up on what Martin is saying, yeah, I mean, it's just far easier to set the price when you control every single step of the supply chain, right? Like, if we see into actual BYD investments into lithium-rich countries such as Chile, Bolivia, stuff like that, they make sure to control the way in which lithium is already extracted and the way in which it's already processed, which takes out the whole process of having to rely on middlemen, right? Other companies like GM, like Chevrolet, they have to essentially rely on other mining companies to give them the raw products in order to process them and turn them into the car parts, right? BYD doesn't do that. BYD eliminates the middleman by directly working with regional governments to make sure that they essentially own the land where the lithium is being extracted, right? And then that land they use it to do projects like the lithium cathode plant. A lithium cathode is like a super advanced part of an electric vehicle, right? So essentially they were trying to make this plant in Antofagasta, Chile, which is a mining rich region, in which essentially it'll make it cheaper for essentially Chilean miners to extract the lithium, send it to the plant to turn it into lithium cathodes, and then give it to BYD for their own electric vehicles. So it's just far cheaper, obviously at the cost of huge environmental problems and huge human rights abuses when it comes to labor, but that's a whole separate issue as well.
Yeah.
When you're looking at the supply chain of, these vehicles, it's mining, refinery, battery production, making the battery pack and then making the vehicle with the battery pack, right? But if these car companies are, and they have been, just as Carlos mentioned, Bolivia, Chile, but also in Brazil, mining operations and refineries right next to them, then they can make the batteries in country and the vehicles in countries, which they have already been doing, such as in Brazil recently.
And I mean, that's not even going to be remotely possible for any other like competitor to be
Yeah.
able to match on. You can't compete on price, you can't compete on supply. The only thing you arguably could compete on is quality. And to your point, at what point is that quality going to outweigh double the cost? Probably not with the majority of people, if given the choice. So that's okay. Going back to a different aspect of this. So thinking about the heavyweights, some of the heavyweight nations in Central and South America, so Mexico and Brazil, BYD is entrenched or trying to encroach on territory of foreign car makers in both of these nations. You know, I know that Mexico has traditionally been especially important for the US automotive market in terms of the production. We've had companies like Ford, we've had GM, and others establish fairly large factories there. How have we seen BYD and other Chinese automotive manufacturers kind of come in and encroach on that space? What are some of the numbers? Are we seeing explosive growth?
We definitely are. I'll hone in on Brazil a little bit with what I'm going to say, but BYD has two factories in Brazil, Camacari and Campanias. The most significant being the one in Camacari, because it actually just recently shut down mid-construction due to slave-like conditions in the facility, more than 160 workers being rescued by Brazil's northeastern state of Bahia. And they were allegedly put in degrading environments. Their passports and salaries were withheld by the building company, which was Jiangxing Construction Brazil. And they sent these workers to the Ford facilities. So they would work and then be sent to housing by the company. And at one of these facilities, workers were made to sleep on beds without mattresses. And each bathroom was shared amongst 31 workers. But overall, the conditions were just horrible. And of course, also BYD has extensive mining rights and growth in Brazil. They recently just got approved for 2 lithium plots in Minas Gerais to begin the production of lithium. So we can see that in Brazil, it's starting that they're taking the mining and refinery to Brazil to then send to those vehicle production plants.
Yeah,
well, China, right? Sorry. Go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, of course. What makes Kamakari so interesting is that it's only 12 hours away from a major lithium site that the Chinese recently bought. So essentially, it's a major 852 hectare site, which is pure, it's called the Lithium Valley for a reason. It has like one of Brazil's largest lithium reserves, and it essentially
and it's really exploding right now.
Exactly. And it has one of the largest reserves, and it's only half a day ride away from Kamakari. So what that means is that they'll be able to exploit all these workers and they're expected to churn out, I think, 150,000 vehicles every year in Kamakari alone, which is a mega factory. That's not even taking into account the other mega factory in Campinas, which is further north in Brazil, right?
And we see that there's a large increase of popularity in Brazil for BYD. Brazil is the top global importer of electric vehicles from specifically China, importing around 789 million in plug-in electric vehicles alone in 2023, which accounted for around 40,000 cars. And in 2022, China registered almost 50,000 EVs in Brazil, soaring the number of registration by 90% the following year. And also China partners a lot with local businesses and manufacturing plants in Brazil to give them an edge in creating the infrastructure to sustain and grow electric vehicles, right? 2024, BYD entered a strategic partnership with Brazil's Raise Power to build BYD Shell electric vehicle charging hubs in 8 major cities over 3 years, including Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte, Brasilia, Curitiba, Florianopolis, Salvador, and Belém, with a plan of overall making 600 different charging piles compatible for both plug-ins and battery electric vehicles.
And another aspect to take into consideration, right? We have supply, right? We have production. Something that when it comes to electric vehicles that we haven't talked about is research and development, right? Of actually ensuring that these products and these things are actually cheaper. China's also dominating in that, as BYD is directly investing with Brazilian universities, namely the State University of Campinas, to develop research centers to make photovoltaic modules, so essentially the solar panels and stuff like that that an electric vehicle would need to make them cheaper or more cost effective. And that technology would then be used in their mega site in Campinas, right? So what you're seeing is essentially that this is like a grand strategy that they're doing to try and dominate every single part of the market, right? They already spent around, so 2025, they already spent around $11 million in research and development into photovoltaic modules alone. That's not even tackling like all of the other research and development projects regarding to this.
And there really is no competition in Brazil whatsoever. It accounts for 70% of all the battery electric vehicles and 60% of all the plug-in electric vehicle sales in Brazil from February 2024 to February 2025, with the second highest brand being Great Wall Motors, which is another Chinese company. But it's only about a tenth or maybe even 11th of the sales that BYD had in that time frame.
So it really is like we see a couple things here that jump out. First off, in some of our previous conversations, we've talked about China's vertical integration on the supply chain, right? How can you own every step of the process from resource extraction to transport of the resource to refinement of that resource to create a finished product and then selling that finished product back to the same market that you extracted the resource from. So it is like it's a money printing machine. Like
Yeah.
that's the definition. Like if you are trying to dominate, that is literally the playbook to do so.
Yeah.
Which, okay, so we're seeing this happen. Is part of this shift and part of China's decision to go with electric vehicles as kind of one of the major money-making mechanisms of the PRC? Is that because of China's relative lack of oil resources, do you believe? Or is that just an area that they've chosen to focus on? Because part of me just wonders, like, how did they kind of come to this as their preferred way of essentially getting in, foot in the door?
China has always, I wouldn't necessarily say it's because of lack of oil, but I would say it was China's goals starting from 2000s to push for growth in electric vehicles because they saw benefit for the Xi Jinping made many policy changes to aid Chinese electric vehicle companies like rebates and aiding them in the mineral supply chain to make them more competitive and give them an edge amongst the global competitors.
Yeah, I mean, to further build up on that, frankly, Ben, if the Chinese want oil in Latin America, they can get it, right? They get it from Brazil, they get it from Venezuela, they get it to a lesser extent from Peru, they get it from lesser extent from Mexico. Like, it's not really a matter of oil. It's the fact that they saw essentially where the wind was blowing when it came to technology, right? They saw where the wind was blowing when it came to a rising dependence on these rare earth minerals such as lithium, such as silicon, such as all these specifically strategic minerals that are coming out of South America and Latin America. And they're like, okay, well, the only way of ensuring our power both within this region and the global market is ensuring that we are the ones that dominate this specific sector of the economy, this specific sector of manufacturing, and it doesn't matter the human or environmental cost that comes with it, right? It doesn't matter if you get a million other cases such as what Martin mentioned in these factories, right? What matters is that they're investing into major rising markets and they're investing into major rising automobile markets, specifically like Brazil and Mexico. Markets that are rising in the GDP are over like 5.5%, I believe, in Brazil. Like we're seeing meteoric rise here, and the Chinese know that, and they're willing to invest all it takes, even if it comes at a tremendous human cost.
So that makes me think too, we're talking about investment here. Has all this investment by BYD, the investment that's brought these mega factories, these mines, etc., have we seen a major uptick in localized development in places where they're active, or has this largely been kind of following the extraction playbook of benefiting a few and leaving the rest as it is?
I mean, it's kind of both when you think about it, right? At its core, it's development, and that was at the beginning, but it's evolved into PRC true strategy of extraction and control of the resources, right? It's the opposite of what we've seen in the past where they extract first and develop later, right? But that's because this is for the consumer. It's a car company. BYD needs to change the script up to get to their overall goal. So they must cater to the consumer first to be able to then invest in growing more efficient supply chains for themselves. So first they exported the cars and they started looking at factories. Then now they're making their factories more efficient because they're buying mining rights right next door. And before China, Latin America wasn't ready for the infrastructure. of EVs. But BYD is taking those necessary steps to make sure that they are by growing their regional technological infrastructure.
I mean, yeah, I would say that it's a partial development in the sense that, yeah, it brings more industrialization, but it's only more industrialization and more development for the sake of extracting more, if that makes sense. Like, it's essentially a cyclical nature that is not so different from cycles we've seen before, in which essentially the investment is coming into these countries for the sake of making them more prone or more efficient when it comes to mass extraction. And this is how they navigate even more populist or even more like anti-corporate regimes, right? Because these anti-corporate regimes, they all live kind of like within a hypocrisy of that they're willing to work with companies as long as they're not Western companies, as long as they're not American companies or European companies, they're willing to let them do whatever, right? So essentially, what we see is a partial development in which, yes, there's more industry, yes, there's more investment, but if you go to the root cause of it, it's not industry for the sake of like developing the other country, it's industry for the sake of making resource extraction more cost effective and more easy.
Sure. And I could imagine with like the Lula government in Brazil, that's been a government that's been traditionally very open to Chinese involvement in a number of areas. So it makes sense, like a you scratch my back, I scratch yours sort of concept. But yeah, I think like seeing the way that they've been able to succeed even in the midst of a variety of different governments, what are the implications on a grander scale? Obviously, for competitor automotive manufacturers, this is concerning because you're not really able to compete. You can only drive your prices down so far before it no longer makes sense for you to even try. How are these nations really receiving BYD at the high level? Like, is there any concern or pushback that you've seen from the mid to high levels of government or industry?
I mean, when you're looking at governance in Latin America, it's the same when it comes to energy investments, same when it comes to infrastructure investments. These Latin American countries aren't going to chase you and ask for your money, but at the same time, they're going to welcome any sort of investment that you have in the region to help their infrastructure and their economy. So I don't see a lot of pushback when it comes to this specifically. I see the opposite. I see them reaching out to say yes to these sorts of investments. And if there's malpractices behind them, but they're not going to say no to the money or the help.
I think the concept that you said right there, Ben, fits it the most. Like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Like, I'm willing to, look past all these human rights issues, all these labor issues, as long as you keep bringing the investment and you keep, bringing in these factories, right? There is some limited pushback depending on the case study. For instance, in Bolivia, right, there was this major agreement made between YLB, which is the state-owned lithium company, and a Chinese consortium to begin like mass processing of lithium in the Uyuni salt flat, which is like one of the major lithium regions, right? Right now, it's kind of in a standstill because it requires legislative approval, and there's like factions of the opposition that don't want it to happen. And similar things have happened, specifically with like Jair Bolsonaro resisting a lot of like Chinese-sponsored projects within Brazil, right? But to answer your question, the opposition is not really strong enough to really stop it most of the time. And most of these things happen regardless because of the whole principle of, as long as you keep bringing these factories, you keep bringing these millions of dollars, and you keep bringing me like token sovereignty, like with this whole Bolivian agreement that gives them 51% of the stake of the agreement. As long as you do all these things, they're willing to look past everything. It doesn't matter.
Right. Got it. No, that makes sense. And so Brazil, we kind of have seen a bit of a picture on what's going on there, how BYD's been able to take advantage. I even read an article on, I believe it was an old Ford factory
Yeah.
that had been there for many years. That was a huge, employment booster. And you see so many people that have been interviewed as part of the article, like waiting for this factory to be online because they're desperate for a job. So, I mean, you see, like, it seems that at least a large population within these places is embracing BYD. That because it's like to a point, you don't really care who is bringing the money so long as someone is, right? So that makes sense. Shifting over to Mexico, I mean, this is a nation that's right here. I mean, it's right at our border. What's the situation and what's the overall feel of Mexico, at least in comparison to Brazil, when it comes to Chinese investment in the EV sector?
Well, Mexico is right there next to the U.S. So there's a lot of importance and a lot of notice when it comes to Chinese EV operations expanding into Mexico, especially northern Mexico has a mature automotive supply chain with a skilled labor force and existing infrastructure. And if Chinese companies start producing cars in Mexico, which is a free trade country, then the Chinese can sell into the United States that are assembled in Mexico and get the $7,500 federal tax credit and undercut U.S. cars. So there'd be potentially need to have another step in place to make sure that they don't, abide by that, because once the Chinese cars enter the U.S., there will be a frenzy toward getting these more cost-effective vehicles. And of course, you have the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 that has already put in place battery sourcing and manufacturing requirements to encourage domestic production of cars. But even then, having these cars there could have not a threat, but at the same time, a concern for many U.S. companies.
Yeah, you're also seeing like these large companies like Photon right now. They're expanding into they have two main sites, one in Lagos de Moreno and one in Tlacomulco de Zúñiga. These are like large, smaller factories. They're not as big as Camacari or like the ones in Brazil. They're essentially slowly but surely expanding, right? And interviews with officials within these companies and within state-owned companies in China that are providing them with the funds, right? All they're saying is, right now we want to solidify the Mexican market first and use Mexico as the jumping point for the rest of Latin America, right? So what they're doing is essentially the same thing they're doing in Brazil. They're working towards ensuring that monopoly of the electronic vehicle market and ensuring that through that they can move into the rest of the region. Right now, these two main sites, they're producing around 1,000 to 1,500 trucks and cars monthly, which is obviously not as much as Brazil, but the matter is that they're growing and that they're working together, right? Like Photon is directly working with BYD is directly working and ensuring that expanding their current availability of manufacturing and like sending more electric vehicles into the Mexican market. So it's like an upward spiral.
Yeah, to add to Carlos, I mean, Photon's a small company, right? But they're exploding. They shared recently that they recorded a 400% increase in sales compared to the same period in 2024 and almost 200% in comparison to their last fiscal quarter. And as you note, they have two factories that plan to have gas and hybrid vehicles. But more importantly, not only do they partner with BYD, but also CATL. CATL being one of the largest lithium-ion producing companies in the world, Chinese company. And on February 8th, CATL and Photon Motor signed a deal marking a 10-year strategic partnership, and they intend to collaborate closely to create more commercial vehicle electrification, as they note, which will leverage their strengths for mutual benefit of creating better cutting-edge technology and batteries. In the note, it says, with the intent of international market expansion. So that's something that must be considered, because that will lead right back to Mexico, where they are expanding rapidly.
Wow, okay. So you also mentioned that BYD and Photon have been helping each other out. To me, that's a crazy concept, because like you think of American manufacturers like Chevy and Ford. I don't know if I've ever heard of something where it's like, oh yeah, let me help you out. Like, I want y'all to sell more Mustangs, even though I sell a competing automobile. So that's interesting, and it makes sense, like the explosive growth, the strategic partnerships with lithium suppliers. Taking a step back and looking at the entire issue from a 30,000-foot view, what is dangerous, or what's the threat to the consumer, like looking at these finished product Chinese automobiles? Like, what are the concerns behind, obviously, an economic standpoint? Do we want to give China a massive foothold? No. But beyond economics, beyond labor exploitation and environmental exploitation, what is the danger behind what's going on?
Well, what's the danger with any monopoly, right? Eventually there's no competition, and eventually you lose both sovereignty and you lose both options when it comes to actually ensuring monopoly. Because you have to understand that Chinese are not, unlike BYD, Photon, they're not coming here for the free market. They're not coming here to freely compete with Western companies. They're pushing them out fully in order to essentially ensure that the only option that's left is them exclusively. That's why they're making specific investments into regions of Mexico such as Coahuila, Chihuahua, Nuevo Leon, all of these major northern Mexican states that have historically already always been like automobile industry states, right? States where Volkswagen, Ford, GM, Toyota, Mazda, all of them have major sites but have been slightly pushed out. And now essentially BYD and Photon, what they're doing is that they're starting to build like their sites, knowing fully that these people need jobs and these people have already worked in the automobile industry, so might as well just bring them in, right? So it's easier to start setting up that manufacturing and slowly but surely push out the West.
Yeah, I one of the things that I did a little research into is obviously, in the US market, this is the telecom sector, so a little different, but a couple years ago, it made big waves when companies like Xiaomi and ZTE, Huawei were banned. Their devices were physically banned from being sold at different cellular retailers here in the US. I remember distinctly, this was in college, but I have AT&T. I was going in to get a new phone. I was getting my upgrade that I do every couple years. And I remember there was a Xiaomi phone that I liked. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And the guy who was working there told me like, oh, I wouldn't get one of these right now. And I was like, oh, really? Like, I wasn't following this at all at the time. And he had told me that, hey, essentially, these rumors that these things are going to be pulled pretty soon. Like, you're not going to be able to buy new. You're not going to be able to get any manufacturer support because there are concerns about the safety and the data integrity of these devices, right? I guess my question is, would these cars is part of the broader concern related to the security of these cars, or is that not really a factor at all?
I think there's always should be a security concern behind these cars. I have no idea with the BYD. I have no idea with the Chinese car, but I know, Tesla, they help use your data when you're driving to help to better utilize their self-driving mechanism so it can learn through an entire database on driving. Could BYD do that? Who knows? I don't have the research to back me, so I'm not going to make a statement on that. But what I will say is if they do and you're a governmental employee, if you work somewhere or non-governmental but adjacent like Three Gimbals or Jack D. Gordon, or driving a Chinese car into NSA is not exactly going to look good because then you give away the base, you give away, the position, you could expose it to have a hack, right? Because what if that car has something that could connect to the facilities? It's stuff like that which can be a concern due to the technology. Yet I don't know if it can, if they have that data and that tracking behind those cars. But if they do, I would take that as a high risk.
Yeah, to further build up on that, when it comes to like just governments, both in the United States and Latin America, right? If you're seeing like these mega corporations slowly but surely gaining so much influence in every step of the way, as we've talked about, right? What feasible opportunity do these governments have of actually enforcing like customer protection policies, right? Like, what power does the Bolivian government, maybe not the Brazilian government, but smaller nations like the Bolivian, the Peruvian government, or the Chilean government gonna be able to do, right? If BYD or if these mega corporations obtain the monopoly that they're looking for, right? When their influence is simply too large to be even to feasibly stop any sort of consumer protection policies or laws or codes or whatever that comes into mind.
And to know off, Carlos, just for context, BYD holds 40% of the Chilean electric vehicle market, while Tesla only holds about 25. So just keep that in mind when we talk about like Chile and stuff like that. That BYD is already invested heavily in that country.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it fits. I can't exactly say that I'm surprised given just the things that we've seen from China across the region, both in this sector and others, but it's definitely something where I'm curious over the next 5 years what'll play out. Are we going to see other countries starting to try to copy the same playbook, try to buy up a bunch of lithium, own the supply chain top to bottom? I mean, we talk about things like resource integrity and resource sovereignty all the time. And I think that's kind of a buzzword term. Like you've heard that pop up more and more. I feel like, people compare the ownership of like lithium or silicon to be like water. Like, hey, if you don't have any sovereign ability to either own lithium producing sites or control a part of the supply chain, you could easily be like physically boxed out of technology production in the future. I just can't help but think like, man, this has got to be a pretty big wake up call for a lot of places, especially if you're a smaller nation, nations without a lot of natural resources within their borders, Have we seen any other nations, not necessarily in Latin America, but elsewhere, have we seen a kind of a push towards resource ownership, or is this kind of something that's very much still a Chinese thing?
Well, I guess you could point out to sub-Saharan African cases in which,
Yeah.
specifically like nations like Mali, like Niger, like Burkina Faso, like these kind of nations try to push towards ownership. However, again, essentially wherever China is involved, it ends up being like the DRC, in which essentially there's monopolies of these rare earth minerals, right? So, and it's very difficult to actually, carry this out, this kind of like home ownership of these minerals, because again, these companies come in here and they're essentially ensuring that they have a scale of influence that makes it so tremendously difficult for any one politician or any one part of the national government to fully sit down and be like, okay, we're gonna nationalize the lithium sector. Like it's next to impossible in a lot
Yeah.
of.
Yeah, because you just don't see a lot of the time, unless you have the capability of ownership and final manufacture, like owning, what good is owning it if you're not able to process it or you're not able to do things with it if given the opportunity? Like, I think to your point, yeah, it helps if you have, it's very difficult. It's easy in theory and it's easy to talk about, but it is difficult to own it end to end.
Scares off investment too.
Yeah,
For sure.
Scares off
yeah.
investment because most investors, they look in your country and they're like, oh, this entire sector just got nationalized from one day to the other. Why is it worth investing in this country then? So it really scares off investment whenever like one of these single countries says, okay, we can no longer invest in this, or you're trying to like convert this into a state-owned company. It's tremendously difficult.
Or even the popularity of the government, right? Like if there are a semi-popular government and they try to nationalize a critical mineral, there's going to be a lot of political upheaval from the citizens. It could create instability and protests throughout the region just because they nationalize that one resource, trying to protect it from foreign investors.
Sure. I mean, I think of like Venezuela with a lot of what they've done. I was reading today about like the permit for Chevron to continue operating there is actually set to expire, and they're likely not going to get that renewed. So, I
Yeah.
mean, they're going to be gone, and they're one of the last, I guess, external companies that's still operating there because so much has been nationalized. I would also be curious, based on the conversation we've had today, to look at the Venezuelan auto market and see. I mean, I'd imagine it's almost all Chinese, just based on what I know, I guess, familiarity with what they've got going on.
I mean, it's fair to say, like, it takes a lot of political capital to fully be able to carry out nationalization, right? And if we look to the big cases of nationalization in like Latin America, they were all cases around like the Cold War and stuff like that, in which, a single movement or politician just had so much popularity and had gained so much power around this specific certain issue that they were allowed to do it. If any other government before or after try to do that, the political connotations would be catastrophic. Like if today, for instance, Brazil try to nationalize the entirety of Petrobras or like the entirety of the oil industry, I cannot tell you what kind of chaos would that.
No, no, but I think this has been a good picture of not only like kind of overview looking at BYD as a company, but also kind of how their strategy and mode of operation sort of works in some of the major markets. I'd also be curious in looking at in the future, talking about the European market potentially, because I know BYD's been making waves there as well. And noticeably too, if you've been over there recently or even looked at sales numbers, you started to see that BYD really making inroads in that market as well, because it doesn't really matter, I think, where you go when you're putting a product forward that looks similar, it drives similar, and it's like a third or a half of the price, and it has a range that's comparable, even if not exactly the same. You will have an audience of people who are willing to entertain that purchase. And so I would like to come back to the table with a little bit more on that, and maybe do a follow-up. I think would be pretty cool. But guys, no, thank you for your time today. I honestly learned a ton, and I hope that those of you listening did too. But Martin and Carlos, I appreciate your time on a Friday. Hope you all have a great weekend.
No, thank
Thank
you,
you, Ben.
Ben.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. And until next time, this has been Navigating in Balance, a podcast by Three Gimbals. If you don't already, I would say subscribe to us on YouTube at Three Gimbals. Our podcasts are always on the channel. We have some really cool short form videos too. If you can't listen to the whole thing, or maybe you just have a couple minutes, you want to kind of like learn a bit or two about an interesting geopolitical topic, feel free to like check out our shorts, or you can listen on Spotify. Find us on LinkedIn as well at the Navigating in Balance page. But until next time, guys, see ya. And yeah, we'll talk soon.